Thank you, Jakob, for agreeing to do this interview for E-Vam Institute. And to start, I'd just like to ask Jakob to tell us a little bit about the tradition that you teach and practice, tradition of Buddhism that you teach and practice in, and how were you first introduced to Buddhism?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, ostensibly, I'm a student of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and I guess more specifically what we call the Nyingma tradition. But that said, I initially took refuge with the Venerable Traleg Rinpoche and the 16th Karmapa. And also, even though I never met Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, I consider myself a student of his. So I identify a lot with the Kagyu tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. But my main teacher was Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, so even though he was famously a non-sectarian teacher and very much promoted this kind of open-mindedness that we associate with what we call the Rimé tradition, he was mainly teaching within the Nyingma tradition. And I also studied with lamas like Tulku Pema Wangyal and Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche and so forth, which mainly teach the Nyingma tradition. I came across Buddhism as a young man when I was asking the big questions about life, and was somewhat critical of the Western, you could say the Western lack of vision in terms of values, in terms of what we could call human potential and so forth. And what was a little bit trending in my day was, of course, that there was a lot of wisdom to be found in the Asian wisdom traditions. And incidentally, I stumbled across Tibetan Buddhism when I was 17, and I was taken with a lot of things that made sense to me. But I was also very clear on my sort of, you could say, native values as a person from modernity. So I approach Buddhism very much from the point of view of somebody who is critically analyzing and critically validating Buddhism. So a lot of the things that you find in Buddhism, for me, took a long time actually to understand. But also I was quite conscientious about my doubts, and so I've followed through with a lot of questioning, and I guess I've ended up being an instructor because my journey was very much about asking questions and then eventually finding answers. So I very much come from a place of sort of sharing, I could say empathizing with those who had questions, and then sort of to the best of my ability sharing whatever little insights I might have about these questions.
I have a question.
Okay.
I read a little bit about your bio. You said you studied BA in Tibetology at Copenhagen University. And in that course, you were looking at the similarities and differences between Western culture in certain areas and the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. I'm just personally curious about what you were interested in exploring in those similarities and differences, and what you found in asking those questions. Yeah.
I went to uni very late. I actually dropped out of high school, and when I was accepted at the University of Copenhagen, it was on the basis of basically getting dispensations. But I had done a fair bit of translation at that point, so I ended up qualifying. But my difference between many people is I started off actually with Buddhist education. My main source of understanding reality was very much coming, of course I was brought up within Western discourse and modern discourse, but still, I was primarily Buddhist. And then at that stage, which was in my 40s, I was exposed to a lot of the humanities and the methodologies of the humanities, and also social and cultural anthropology and so forth, which enabled me to get a great understanding of the Western view, and particularly the limitations actually, because as a Buddhist, you're sort of brought up being very polite and diplomatic with regards to other cultures. So I was sort of always giving modern culture the benefit of the doubt and thinking, there's a lot of great stuff out there, but not really knowing it, I didn't really take much of a critical attitude. Whereas becoming exposed to some of the basic sort of ideas that inform the modern outlook, I began to see the value of the Buddhist, you could say the Buddhist path, and the limitations of some of the ways that we think of the world in the modern context. So I found it very helpful, and that's where I was able to identify the differences between these two views, and of course identify the differences in the methodologies, structuralism, and so forth, the way that we approach and see the world in the Western sense, and identify the value of the human existence, and the way that we do it in the Buddhist context. But it was very valuable actually to further appreciate the Buddhist outlook, having some background in understanding the Western outlook. Yeah.
And also in your bio it says you've lived quite a cosmopolitan life, in that you grew up in Denmark, and then you spent some time in beer in India, and now you're in Australia. I'm just curious as to how in the places that you've lived, how you've seen the adoption of Buddhist traditions and practices in Western culture, and also the reviving of it in India. Have you noticed any differences in the way that practices have been adopted or emphasized in Western countries, I guess?
Yeah, well, that's a biggie, because of course Buddhism is new in the Western world, and initially when I went to India I was only 18, and there I was very interested in seeing how Buddhist practice, Buddhist view affected cultural practices. I was very interested in the dynamics between the generations in Asian and Tibetan communities, how children interacted with their elders and so forth, because the difference between modernity and some of the ancient cultures is that in modernity you're always basically invalidating those that are older, then once you're over a certain age, you actually no longer, sort of your view is no longer valid. And so modernity is that you constantly have to be modern, you have to be new. Whereas in other cultures, the wisdom of the elders is something that everyone looks up to. So I was interested in the differences that I would encounter, and I was very encouraged by seeing the sense of safety that exists within, you could say, traditional Asian cultures, and just the way that people would feel secure in those cultures, and the interaction between the generations, not having the gap that I had been familiar with. So that was interesting for me as such. Then of course the whole appropriation of Buddhism in the modern world was immensely interesting, because I encountered Buddhism as something that was potentially really interesting, really valuable, also incredibly alien. And the initial romantic hippie appropriation of Buddhism was quite comical, and kind of very often rather misguided. And so there you needed some how do you say, guidance there. The hippies were really confused in their projections onto Buddhism, ways of assimilating. Essentially it was sort of warped in many ways, but it was following pretty much colonialist practices from earlier, like the natives out there have something interesting, we're going to turn it into something that suits us. So that's where you had someone like Chogyam Trungpa, and also Traleg Rinpoche, who made tremendous contributions cutting through spiritual materialism and presenting Buddhism within a Western vernacular. And that really began to make a huge difference in terms of authentic Buddhism being presented in the modern world. So that's been a joy to discover how amazingly versatile Tibetan masters were in presenting what is something that's universal to a culture that was completely unfamiliar with them. We can sort of say, oh yeah, many of the teachers, they sort of have archaic methods. But let's face it, it's been a very short time, very few decades that authentic Buddhist lineages have been introduced in the modern world. And I think, you know, the Buddhist masters, they've done remarkable work. And particularly then, of course, Traleg Rinpoche, Trungpa Rinpoche, and others. Yeah, it's happening. It's happening.
And how do you see it happening? Talked a little about the past and the hippie appropriation of Buddhism and the way it sort of weaved its way into Western culture. How do you see it happening at the moment, in the present, and also how do you see it happening in the future? You know, so future being, 10, 20 years from now.
Yeah. Well, I think we're all becoming more real about Buddhism. So a lot of the early naive assumptions are sort of been replaced by more realistic ways of approaching Buddhism. I still think that the real big challenge lies in the way that Buddhist knowledge is perceived, and right now I would say we still struggle with a misperception of Buddhism as a belief, as cultural practice, as religion. Because in the modern world, these terms, belief, religion, and so on, they basically spell out ignorance. They spell out things that are not valid for the modern person. And that's where we, in the modern world, where we ascribe tremendous authority to a science that's evidence-based, that's empirical, and so forth, we need to do that with Buddhism also, but we need to identify, and this is someone like Alan Wallace actually speaks a lot about how we need to begin to appreciate Buddhism as empirical, but it's just an empiricism that's situated within the subjective dimension. And that's no less real than the objectivist science. Possibly even more real because the objective dimension is perceived by the subject. And so unless we actually really clarify the subjective, the consciousness that observes and so forth, it's dubious whether we even have a proper science that so they can have an idea about both the inner world of, you could say, the phenomenology of the individual and also of the outer world. So I consider Buddhism a science that operates with what really matters, which is the dimension of the mind, of consciousness, and so forth. But until Buddhism is seen as a valid, as possessing this incredible heritage of knowledge, and addressing a really essential aspect of our existence, until Buddhism is recognized as, you could say, a valid voice within within communities of science, and a valid participant in all the important big conversations we're having. Until that happens, Buddhism, classified as a religion, is a little bit an endangered species. You know, it might be sort of upheld because it's sort of part of an ancient legacy of ancient cultures, and it's a bit like saving the dolphins or whatever. It's sort of like something that's wonderful and so forth, but it's still seen as something that's marginal. And there's been some interesting comments on this about how Buddhism is still represented in departments of Asian studies and so on as essentially something that's foreign, something or Orientalism that still prevails within Asian studies, and still the way that Buddhism is represented is very often is represented as something that's foreign, as something other. So until we get over that, then I hope over the next decades that will take place, but that I think is that really depends on Buddhism extracting itself from this classification as a religion and entering into a more, you could say, as an equal contender in the modern conversation around what really matters, the issues of science and our understanding of the world. Yeah.
And how important is the role of language in the transmission of Buddhism to any culture, but specifically the West? Because you know, religion and belief are quite loaded terms, and science is seen as valid. How important do you think the role of language and translation is in the transmission of Buddhism?
Well, it's important, but we have to remember language is essentially, they're all signifiers, and what we want to get onto is the actual objective of language, the signifier. And that's where Buddhism has done remarkably well, because it has, and wherever it's moved into, it's always adapted itself to the language. So you have Buddhism, which is about freeing the individual, the mind, consciousness, of its, you could say, confusion, and liberating what we could call the potential of consciousness, which is, you know, where we are beginning to have an accurate view of reality. That condition of enlightenment is universal. And so the objective of the path, of the Buddhist path, is something that's universal. And the means to get there depends really on challenging the ways that these limitations are constructed in various cultures. So the various Buddhist paths, as they exist in Tibet, Japan, India, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Burma, Korea, Japan, and so on, the way that Buddhism has been presented in these cultures, we've seen Buddhism being very flexible and adapted to those cultures. You know, you do enlightenment the Japanese way in Japan, you do it, you know, the Tibetan way in Tibet, and so on. Of course, we have to distinguish between the different methodologies that have to do with the various, you know, yanas, the various perspectives that we have, sort of, in terms of what we call doxography, or in terms of doctrine, sure. But the Buddhist teaching has been incredibly versatile in terms of adapting itself to cultures. And so nowadays we see Buddhism, of course, based on the traditional heritage and the traditional masters and so on, yet being communicated in language of psychology, or contemporary science, or our languages around ethics and so forth. So the objective of Buddhism is universal, lies beyond words, and Buddhism has been very skillful in, you could say, pointing to that which lies beyond words on the basis of the words and the language of particular cultures. So I remember once speaking with Dingwachen's Rinpoche, and I was saying, you know, it's frustrating to not, you know Tibetan properly. And he said, don't worry, the essence of the teaching can be transmitted. That was very reassuring. Yeah. And you see someone like Traleg Rinpoche and Chogyam Trungpa and, you know, other lamas who really successfully use the language of modernity.
There's a few people in the community who may be thinking about doing some retreat, and Jakob, you've done a 3-year retreat, and I was just wondering if you could say something on the benefits of retreat.
Oh yeah. Yes, do a retreat. It's very useful. It's like meditation. Do meditation. Be compassionate. Be mindful. You know, all of these various aspects of the path, they're very, very useful. And of course, retreat, as I see it, was very much like doing seminar. It's a time when you really focus on the path without distraction. So just like people, people might want to become doctors, and you could get your degree in medicine sort of via evening school, but it generally helps to go to uni and focus for a rather extended period on the study of medicine. And so likewise also, if you really want to properly engage in the path, it's very helpful to do that in a retreat context.
And to play devil's advocate, what are the challenges of retreat, or when should someone maybe think about not doing retreat, if there is any time?
Well, you know, if your spouse is not happy and your parents object and your children won't have it, and you know, you have to think twice. But the thing about retreat is actually it provides provides the best circumstances. So if you can't go into retreat, it's good, and particularly because we are who we are, we're easily seduced by distractions. We're easily sort of carried away by the demands of ordinary life. So retreat, in a way, is making it easier for ourselves. There's less choices in retreat. And I would also say, in my experience, what sometimes people think in that, you know, you're how do you say, you're denying yourself by going in retreat. Not really true. You're sort of denying yourself when you're not in retreat. You sort of get caught up in really superficial, unnecessary concerns. And I never experienced anybody really having claustrophobia or suffering tremendously in a sort of unsurmountable way in retreat. It works, and it's like I said, it makes things easier. Yeah. As long as you're free to go, you know.
Yeah.
Ask your wife first, you know.
I will.
Talk it through with your children.
This is the last question, unless Pete has any questions. And I don't know whether to bring it up or not, but...
You're going to do it anyway?
Yeah, I'm going to do it anyway. To what extent do you think Buddhism includes a political aspect? You mentioned before about Buddhism not having a platform or a voice, or not being seen as valid.
Participant.
Do you think that there's a political aspect that could be accessed, or...
Look, I think it's a question of discourse, and I think we have what is it called, social or cultural analysts, they refer to as a discursive hegemony. There's a way that we think of the world nowadays that's totally accepted and unquestioned. And Buddhism is outside of the box of that. It completely sees existence in a different light. So right now, I think Buddhism needs to engage in the conversation first, not in a political way, but more actually sort of getting in there. And so that's what I think the way forward. Buddhism as a political, I don't know, movement would be unnecessary, because it almost is you could say counter to the Buddhist principles of non-aggression, that you don't really see yourselves as opposed to others. You're very much there listening to others. What you can do sometimes, and which is the Buddhist methodology, is you can expose the shortcoming in others' reasoning. That's sort of the middle way approach. And that's where, as a participant, you could say you represent an alternative view, but it doesn't really come about through polemics and polarizing. It's very much about rather engaging. So I think the way forward for Buddhism is not really politics, but it's more actually, becoming a participant in the larger conversation. Tsongtse Rinpoche has a lot of activity, and one of his main roles, of course, is teaching Buddhism. And in that context, he has an organization that's called Siddhartha's Intent, which is an international organization. But he has here in Australia then a branch of that which is called Siddhartha's Intent Australia, and I'm one of the instructors there. And I run programs of various kinds. I do seminars in various towns, like right now I'm doing a seminar here in Melbourne. So I do this in different places, in Sydney, in Adelaide, Melbourne, Brisbane, Canberra, and these are very much, you could say, classroom situations where I present Buddhism. I also then run retreats where people retreats that are mainly about sitting meditation. I think that's very important, shamatha vipassana. But also a lot of what I do is pointing to the Vajrayana tradition, of course. And then also I do online courses, and I just wanted to mention actually that in doing online courses, which is essentially studies of particular works, so far I've done two of Traleg Rinpoche's titles. One is Essence of Buddhism, which I stumbled across years ago, and I just thought that is such a clear presentation of Buddhism. It's really remarkable. So I was really happy to come across that. And then at one point somebody gifted me karma, and what it is, and why it matters. And I found that immensely helpful, clarifying this very important topic. And I did that as an online study, and people really liked it, so I ended up doing that twice. And then recently somebody gave me Traleg Rinpoche's book on desire. And so what I read in that I found immensely helpful also. So I'll be doing here in the course of 2020, I'll be going through an online study of desire. Mm-hmm. So that's a little bit roughly of what I can remember that I'm doing right now. I also do some other online courses. Basically, right now I'm running 4 weekly courses. I do one, which actually I'm indebted to Traleg Rinpoche. I'm doing one on Longchenpa's Finding Rest in the Nature of Mind, which the commentary of which is called The Great Chariot, and Traleg Rinpoche taught on that. So partly in the course of that, I'm drawing on Traleg Rinpoche's commentary. Then I'm running a course on Mondays, which is on Abhidharma. Then on Wednesdays I do one which is an introduction to meditation, and there I'm using a work by Chogyam Trungpa called Mindfulness in Action. So, and then on Thursdays I'm doing a work also on karma by Chogyam Trungpa that's called The Future is Open. So, and incidentally, I would argue that the editors of that book, The Future is Open, they're drawing on Traleg Rinpoche because they have a subtitle of that. Like Traleg Rinpoche's book on karma, the subtitle is what it is, what it isn't, and why it matters. They have good karma, bad karma, and beyond karma. So, which is clearly also sort of drawing in that format. But anyway, that I'm doing on Thursdays then. So these courses, they're running weekly. Yeah, if anybody's interested, you can go to si.org.au and you can find information about these courses and in general what we're doing in Siddhartha's intent. Yeah.
That sounds great. I'm going to go to that website right now. Well, thank you so much, Jakob, for taking the time. It's very generous to take the time, and thank you. It's lovely talking to you.
Yeah, lovely being here.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.